From the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island, you are watching live coverage of the Mackinac Policy Conference here on Detroit Public Television. So if we're going to build a better state, we need better education policy, better student outcomes. Three folks who think a lot about that are joining us now. We've got Monique Stanton, CEO of Michigan League for Public Policy, Amber Arellano, Executive Director of Education Trust Midwest, and Democratic Representative Matt Koleszar. Thank you all so much for making the time.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
Thank you.
So like I said, I know all of you are continually thinking about student outcomes, education in this state. Amber, first, I'm hoping you can just sort of level set the table for us just about how Michigan students are doing. You look at the data, put us this into context about where we're at.
Sure. I think for people who grew up in Michigan, we often, as I did, and I'm sure many of you did, we often prided ourselves as having one of the better education states in the country, and I think we did for many decades. And over the last 20 years, that's really changed. Since the early 2000s, Michigan has either declined or been stagnant in almost every student outcome, whether it's been lower school math, whether it's been reading, whether it's been high school outcomes. And we're also really struggling on college attainment and post-secondary access outcomes. So in many ways, the pandemic has exacerbated those trends, right? And so when we've looked at the data in recent months about how we've been doing compared to other states, there have been other states that are seeing education recovery for their kids, seeing at a faster rate. And so it's really a great time for us to reset and rethink about what are we doing as a state? How are we investing in our public education system? How are we going to better support students and teachers at the same time to reach better outcomes? I think there's a broad consensus that there needs to be more investment, but a lot to think about and a lot to consider about how do we get there? How do we invest? How best to leverage those investments to make sure that all students are benefiting? So there's a lot of conversation here on the island about that this week.
That can feel really overwhelming, right? And that's just one aspect of these conversations that we're having about growing population, about our next workforce. Representative Koleszar, talk to me a little bit about, is Lansing aware of just what an issue this is? You yourself, we should note, are a former school teacher, so Absolutely. You are. But is the Capitol understanding that we're not doing that well right now?
I think the Capitol is absolutely aware of what's going on right now. And I think that's why you've seen education as such a high priority right now, especially in the State House. I can tell you right now, we are looking at the potential for a $366 per pupil increase. Mm-hmm. The governor's recommended as high as $450 per pupil. In addition to that, we also are recognizing there's so many other factors for our kids in terms of their learning. One of the big things I'm a proponent of is universal meals for all kids in our schools. You can't expect a student to worry about their test that they have or their homework if they're worried about where their next meal is going to come from. So in school, if we have that ability to make sure our kids are fed, we put them in the best possible situation to succeed. And to me, that is the most basic, fundamental thing that we need to start with, is making sure our kids are taken care of.
And of course, the governor outlined that in her budget recommendation back in February. Right now, the State House, the State Senate Conference Committee about the budget. Will those dollars be in the final K-12 budget?
Absolutely. I am very confident. I say absolutely as a one vote of 110 in the House, but I absolutely think there is the collective will to do this. I think, and I can tell you from a teacher's standpoint, I can't tell you how many times I saw students that were on free and reduced lunch that were embarrassed. They would try to hide in a hallway. They may skip a meal altogether. There's also a lot of students that fall through the cracks that may not necessarily qualify, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily getting food at home that they need. So we're going to do a lot of good things for kids.
One of the things that I'm really excited about the universal school lunch is that reduction of stigma and accessing food so all kids can get a lunch. There's no stigma. There's no extra paperwork. Just makes things so much more accessible for our youngest people. Well,
let's jump a little bit into that. The league recently put out a report, and one of the fundamental foundations that I found interesting was this idea of educational justice. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about what educational justice means to you, because it feels like maybe there could be some, ending of stigma. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So educational justice, we want to talk about equitable school funding. Mm-hmm. So where in our state do kids need extra funding to help adjust for concentration of poverty? We recognize that not all kids need the same things. And so if we look at a weighted school funding formula for poverty, for high need learners, for English as a second language, for special education, we can start getting at some of those critical educational gaps. And then beyond that, looking at things like social determinants of health, so food, behavioral health access, mental health counseling, do we have housing stability? All those things set a really essential framework and foundation so kids can be successful from their littlest days all the way through post-secondary education.
I mean, Amber, it sounds like a really holistic approach.
Absolutely. And I think this question about what do kids need is like really will be a fundamental shift for the state. When you think about Prop A and that shift in the 90s, it was thinking about trying to get all students to sort of a floor that everybody could agree on. Mm-hmm. And I think since then we've realized as a country and as a state that not every child has the same need, right? And so like setting a floor alone isn't enough. If you think about what Monique is saying in terms of considering for like each individual child's need, think about the wealthiest community that you know in your region and like the least wealthy community you know in their region and the different capacities that those communities have to be able to support their kids, whether it's after school tutoring or summer programs or tutors for educational recovery from the pandemic, whatever it is. I think it's great that there's so much conversation about how do we consider for those differences in our funding formula so that we make sure that all kids are reaching a way high level. And it's really a struggle in Michigan. We're considered one of the least equitable education states in our school funding formulas, one of the most regressive school funding formulas in the country. So hopeful that we'll be able to make some progress on that in the next month in our current budget, but also in the next few years.
No, our kids count data really showed that Michigan last year was ranked 40th in terms of educational outcomes. We need to be doing better when we're talking about our goals to have 60% of our people in Michigan achieving some kind of post-secondary success. Mm-hmm. If we want to shift the narrative around our declining population in Michigan, our aging population, we need to make sound investments in our youngest people and young adults.
And to both of your points, when you make resources available to students, they will respond.
Right.
I don't care where they are from. I taught in a rural district. I represent a suburban district. And I can tell you when students have those resources available to them, they will respond. They will take advantage of those opportunities. And as long as we can do our part from the state to be a resource for those kids and those schools, we absolutely can lift the achievement of our students. There's no doubt in my mind.
Can I piggyback on that?
Please.
So there's some forthcoming research coming from the West Coast, from California, about the impact on student outcomes from its funding formula, which was changed several years ago. It's called the local control funding formula, and it moved California to a weighted student funding formula. So there's significant more dollars going to the most vulnerable students in the state, and it's finding that it's working, that they're seeing significant growth among all groups of students, no matter what the region where they live, what their race is, what their income is. They're seeing significant improvement across all students, but especially for vulnerable students. So I think that's really promising. We should be looking for that in the coming weeks and months. I think there's also a growing body of evidence in California that having more money alone isn't enough. We need systems of fiscal transparency and accountability. There's been a lot of evidence in recent years in California that a little less than 50% of dollars going for low-income students, for example, are actually reaching their schools. So whenever we think about investment in Michigan, we also have to think about how do we put mechanisms into place to make sure that the dollars are actually getting to the kids for whom the dollars are intended. So a lot of work to do on that.
Yeah, we've just got about a minute left, so it's going to be a lightning round. But I'm curious if there was one thing that you could change right now that would sort of be, portend for better outcomes for students. Waving your magic wand, Representative, I'll start with you. What would it be?
Access to more literacy programs and support.
Amber?
Fundamental shift in our funding formula, accompanied with strong accountability and transparency that's not just available for leaders in the state, but for parents, so that parents and families can be more involved in conversations with their schools about what they feel like their kids and their communities really need from their school.
Monique, a magic
wand.
I
would say weighted school funding and investments in social determinants of health.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time and the brains that you're putting into this work.
Thanks so much, Zoe.